I was reading First Corinthians the other day, and I was reading chapter 13, and just that love chapter. And why do I always pause at the verse that says, when I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put childish things behind me. There's something about that verse that just acknowledges seasons and growth and change and transitions that I love. And I recognize in my life, in those around me, how over the years we're just different. And there's this call in Scripture for us to grow and develop and move from children to men. And I'm sitting with a couple of men. I'm sitting with Alan Arnold and Morgan Snyder, and this is Craig McConnell. And we thought it'd be just a good conversation to share how we've changed, how we've grown over these last seasons, and what we've seen in one another in terms of growth, and have a little fun in the process. And I guess let me throw the question to you two. Have you seen growth? Have you changed? Are you a different man now than you were a few years ago?
Craig, you posed that question to us a couple days ago to think on and pray through regarding this podcast. And even the way you posed it a couple days ago was, how have we changed over the decade? Mm-hmm. And it was interesting. I had two reactions immediately to it. The first was I was so excited to be a part of the conversation with you two on this, because in some ways, as my beliefs have developed, it's become the most important question to be asking. And like Dallas says, the most important thing about a person is not what he does, it's who he becomes. Mm. And I think so often we can lose sight of the Christian life is a constant maturing, a constant growing, as you said, with First Corinthians. And so I was so excited because I've really dedicated my last decade to focus on the process of becoming and becoming good soil. My second reaction was I felt like I'm the least qualified person to answer that question.
Yeah.
Right? In some ways, I mean, truly, as I was praying about this morning, I thought to do that question justice, you need to bring my wife in the studio, mm-hmm. my kids in the studio, you know, the men who have been closest to me over the decade and witnessed me in time, and ask them. And so I'm a little sheepish to even dive into it because I don't know that I'm even the one to evaluate that.
I had the same reaction, Morgan, when I was sitting down. I thought, I can make observations about you guys.
Yes.
And then when it came to myself, I could recount encounters and things with God that seemed life-altering. But when it came down to summarizing how I'm a different man this decade than last, I go, oh, man, you know, it's others who really need to comment on that.
Right.
So
we're
willing to offer you some
hey,
feedback, buddy.
You've been with me for 10 years.
My gosh.
I'm all ears and have permission to edit.
Plus, in a soundproof booth, we have your wife.
Oh, I was kind of joking.
Your neighbors.
So, Sherry, just hit the red button there, and anytime you want.
I would be concerned, but I know how Red Smart works, and that's way too much planning.
Yeah. But what would you say, Morgan, just from your own perspective?
Yeah, you know, it was interesting. As I prayed about it, I realized the last decade of my life overlapped with the beginning of the season of having children. Joshua's 10 years old now. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very poignant season of my life to evaluate. And in some ways, I've come to the reality that a decade really is a good measuring stick in a way. You know, it's a good amount of time where I want to sit back and ask the question, what is the fruit in my life of the gospel that I'm living based on my actions that are revealing these beliefs? And so, you know, when I looked at it, I said, you know what, there are these core areas that I would say have shifted pretty profoundly in some deep places. And the first was intimacy with God. I think that a decade ago, I would have been mostly in the posture of living for God, but not really living like with God. A true union with him, a true life. The term I would use is a secret life. Where I was looking at it now, Craig and Ellen, and realizing, boy, through partnership with God, we've cultivated a secret life, an inner life that is a union that is still a mess and still has so much growth, but it is so different to live from that relationship as this hour-by-hour source of life than just a set of principles and trying to be a good man, but so much of it lives in self-determination.
Yeah.
Morgan, that's great that you said that, because one of my observations about you is on that very thing. You say the last decade, but what was the catalyst, the impetus for this change from principles and kind of going after life and trying to apply truths and so on and so forth to this intimacy with God? Is it just a natural result of getting older over time, or were there key events and things? You mentioned marriage, children.
Craig, it's a good question. I think most of it, I would say, comes out of pain and desire.
Right.
You know, really for me, it's that transition from the late 20s into the early 30s was the kind of a decade ago. And it was that major shift of going into marriage and young career, young kids, you know, where your life matters to other people. And so all of a sudden, in some ways, there's this crucible where I couldn't live as sloppy, even in my spiritual life. And so it was out of a desperate need for more life. It was almost like out of needing an upgrade, a bigger portion of God. And then it was a decade of, you know, trial and error and training and figuring it out, you know, sitting under mentors like Richard Foster and Dallas Willard and Ransom Hart, of course, where we practice these life-giving disciplines. And so I would say it was out of the pain and the longing for more and being honest with, you know, one of the questions you asked me years ago in that process of, what do you think your effect is on people? And then you kind of segued into the reality that how we relate with others is truly the greatest indicator, the most helpful indicator of our spiritual maturity. And it was pretty convicting because I realized publicly to people at a distance, I can have a mostly good effect. And yet as you got to the closer circles, I realized the pain, my drivenness and my achievement, my focusing on outcomes, the pain it would cause my wife and my kids and my close friends. So that process of being honest with life isn't working. I need a bigger gospel and I need more of my heart back.
Yeah. One of the things I've seen, Morgan, that was huge, and you refer to it under kind of the general term pain, was when your brother Lance died, there was something about his death and all that threw you into, required of you, all that meant to you. It felt like that was such a sobering event. And there were other painful things that you've shared in other stories and other places that surrounded that time. But it seemed like so many of your externals falling apart brought you to, I don't know if sobriety is the right word, but a turn inward.
Yes.
That was new.
Yes.
And just a recognition that as successful as your story has been with being class presidents and always looked to as leader, your own personal view of being Atlas and having to bear this weight, that none of that was working.
Yes.
If I was to account for what have you seen in Morgan's life that's been crucial to his growth, maturity, his walk with Christ, it has been the pain.
Yes.
That kind of forced you to look inward because outwardly you were doing pretty good and it wasn't good enough.
Well said, because the gospel I was living, though it was a productive gospel, it was still deeply rooted out of an orphan spirit and a gospel without sonship, right? And so what you're describing, that suffering and that inward looking caused me to deal with the reality of I'm still trying to be the strongest man in my world, that self-sufficiency is still a god. And the decade was one of saying, is there an alternative? And that's, you know, the beautiful holy story of becoming a son. And out of the place of sonship, this whole new reality being birthed, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so you're right, Craig. I think from that place of sonship, which has been just the reality of the transformation over the last decade, I even see these other categories that have emerged to really stand out. For example, the category of self-care. mean, I would say self-care was non-existent 10 years ago when I had little kids and I was working so hard as an event director at Ransom Heart to come through for so many people, always up, always on. And self-care wasn't a category. I think there was a lot of roots of shame, a lot of roots of self-hatred. And over the decade, as God has allowed me to grow in sonship and to break off that self-hatred and that shame, I've learned, like Parker Palmer says, that self-care is actually never a selfish act. It's simply good stewardship of the only thing that I have, the gift that I have to bring and offer others. And so it's little shifts externally, but internally, it's a radical shift to learn how to care for myself and let God tend to my soul so that I can be well in a way that is more accessible to God and therefore more loving to the people around me.
So, Morgan, how does that look, though, when you have 2 young kids,
Right.
a wife, full-time job?
Right.
You love to write, so there's writing that you do in
Yes.
addition to that. How do you take care of yourself well and make that a priority and still feel like you can do everything else you need to do in your
Yes.
world?
Man, it's a great question. And in that decade, I'm still in it, And, as a recent example, last night we had some friends over and it ended up a great night, but ended up being a later night than we had intended, late to get the kids to bed and that routine. And then it was a pretty rough night with some nightmares and the kids were up and down and up and down. And I wake up, Abigail, she's in between Sherry and I was just going, I just desperately need a little sleep. I need an apartment. And
No, you don't.
yeah, okay. So I'm still in the throes of it in lots of ways because the beliefs have changed, that my heart matters to God, that time is valuable to him. An example of going to bed earlier last night so that I did get more rest, so I could get up early this morning, and I'm in my basement, and I'm praying, and I'm worshiping in my little secret place with this little floor heater, and it's like, it's not the hours that I'd love to have, but this morning it was 30 minutes, and then it got cut off because Sherry came down the stairs saying, hey, I need help. I know it's my morning to take the kids to school, but the kids still need help with their spelling. And I was good because I had actually tended to my heart compared to kind of thinking, not believing that there isn't life in that discipline. And so just not doing it. Yeah. So just a little example and carving out time for a workout, later today, that there's so many demands on my time today that's a little irrational unless you believe that getting outdoors on a trail today is essential for a lifestyle that's rooted in intimacy with God. So those are just a few small examples from today.
That's so good.
Is today our workout day?
Whoa.
Is today upper body or lower body?
You're wearing your spandex, so we better work out.
Yeah, I'm thinking upper body today. Morgan, one of my observations was this in the same area. I mean, I just affirming what you're saying about self-care. And listeners, you need to be aware of when I see Morgan in flip-flops, I know this is a different man.
Oh,
now he wears his flip-flops and the wrong toes, and he's not totally there yet. But you used to be, Morgan, a man who lived with a drivenness that if the continuum was 1 to 5, you were pretty much at 5 or close to it all the time. I mean, it's just stunning that how busy and active and driven you were. And you saw that, and then you intentionally kind of put that at the top of your list of things to take to Christ and just say, Jesus, work here. And you're living at 2s and 3s consistently in ways that just 10 years ago wasn't even a category.
Well, a great example that I saw you do this with, Morgan, is at the intensive last year. And so you're at the intensive. There was a situation that came up with a person there where I felt like, man, as the leader of the intensive, I've got to get Morgan involved in this.
Yes.
It's like he would want to know. He may need to be the guy who makes some decision or takes an action. And so I found you. I went up to your cabin. It was late at night. And you were in there with another friend just talking and enjoying a conversation. And I can remember coming up, knocking on the door, short of breath. Morgan, here's what's going on, and what should we do? And the ball's in your court. What do you want to do? And a driven man, or a man who feels like he's the Lone Ranger decision maker, would have immediately gotten sucked into that.
Yes.
Let me solve it. Here, I'll take action. Where's the situation happening? And I loved how you just remained totally calm, totally true to who you were. And you just said, I don't really know if this does need my attention. It may be it just needs God. You said, why don't we pray and see what God says? And I remember everything in me was, let's do something.
Yes.
And you were the calm. You didn't kick it up to a 5 and become productive. You were the calm in the center of everything that just said, let's pray, let's ask God. And in that situation, the decision was, yeah, I feel like God's saying, this isn't really me.
Yes.
But why don't we get this other person to go talk to them because of their experience? It was an amazing decision because that's just what this other person needed, was not you, but was God and this other man that we brought in. And I think that just showed a depth and a maturity. I think you would have handled that probably differently 10 years ago.
Yes.
Yep.
But it's so good to get feedback because as you guys are sharing those stories, I'm going, really? Like, really, really? Because something in me knows it's true. I do see fruit. I feel the life of flip-flops in a way where I was just appalled by guys that would wear them a decade ago, right?
Hey, come
But
on.
I always have a special place for you. But honestly, I felt like, Craig, the scale you give 1 to 5, and I always had it pegged at 5 or 6, I feel like, well, maybe I'm at a 4.75 now, right?
Yeah.
Emotionally, internally, you feel like, really, I've grown that much? Because you constantly see where you haven't grown. But the truth is, I've grown to a point where I'm so dissatisfied with a 5 that I can't even get it in that gear as much. So what I just want to say is thank you for the feedback because you need other eyes because it's so easy to be the biggest critic of yourself. And while there's lots to grow in, God has done some things.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, Morgan. When you use the term self-care, it's only a person who's driven and kind of high-intensity, performance-oriented, get it done, much is expected of me, who would view being still, finding God, and developing an internal life and that secret communion with God. It would only be that person that calls it self-care. It's actually just walking with God. It's like just spiritual depth and intimacy, isn't it? Do you know what I'm saying? That the driven guy feels like it's selfish and what place does this have because it doesn't seem productive.
Oh, right. What you're saying, I do receive it as true. And just as a intense person, I'm just aware of like how much heroism it takes, to, like you said, it feels radical. I mean, last night had some friends over and I know Sherry wants to process after that, but I kind of spent all my currency and I just knew I'd be doing it out of striving. And instead, I just said, Cher, I'd love to talk about tonight some other time. And instead, 15 minutes, I made a fire and just sat and just looked at the fire and enjoyed that stillness. But you're right, Craig. That should be part of simply walking with God. But just to name for a driven person there's a severe battle against believing that value.
Yeah. You put into words what I was trying to say is that it's simply caring about your heart, really. And that's the centrality of everything.
Yes.
Another thing that I saw in you, which I really savored, was when you went on your sabbatical a few months ago, before you left, we had a conversation, and I know you love books and know you love to read and biographies especially. So we were having a conversation on what are you bringing? You're going to have a couple of weeks away from civilization in a setting where you could devour several books.
Yes.
And when you told me, well, really, the only thing I'm bringing, I feel like God just told me to bring the Bible.
Yes.
And I'm just going to read through that. Not even going to try to read so many chapters or books, but just take it in. I love that because for a driven, productive guy, even when you're on vacation, there's a temptation to get things done, check things off a list. And for you to be not only able to say, I'm not really bringing any book but one.
Yes.
And I may only get through a couple of chapters or a book. That to me was a huge difference in the man maybe you would have been 10 years ago, where you would have had 15 books in a backpack,
right?
Versus now at peace with, it's not about productivity or getting things done or read. It's just about communing with God and replenishing.
Well, and it's still, I just want to name, it's a journey, and he's in there, right? He's in there. But I think what you're saying, Alan, really helps put words to this other core category of how are you changing over the decade. Dallas Willard says that actions follow beliefs 100% of the time. In other words, our actions tell us what we truly believe. So we can say we believe certain things, but our actions reveal belief 100% of the time. And if I look back a decade ago, I think my actions revealed far deeper than I would have wanted to admit. I was concerned about my bank account quite a bit. I was concerned about my title. I was concerned about outcomes and how I'm coming through for people, coming through for my wife, coming through for my kids. But Alan, to contrast that with the sabbatical, I lived those productive years, and you look at the fruit. And to Craig's point, in counseling me, there's a lot of destruction in relationship. And now I'm watching my kids grow, and now I realize what I want is to be present to them. And so this sabbatical, like, who gets that? What a gift. I don't want to tank it by those measuring sticks. What I want is to seize the moment. And this moment, it's intimacy with God. It's intimacy with my wife and my kids. You can't get that back. And if God is a generous father, I want to roll the dice and see, is it possible to unplug from technology for several weeks? Is it possible to go back to your first love, the scriptures that are supposed to be an exciting kingdom story that we're swept up into, and so often we just treat it like it's a chore? And I didn't know the answers to that, but I wanted to roll the dice and try it on. So there was enough shift of the beliefs to have enough of the actions to say, I want to give this a try. So I do think, just naming, there has been this shift in the decade of moving from, as a man, all these other things having my report card, to kind of extracting it increasingly and giving that to God the Father.
That's good.
Yeah.
Morgan, what else do you have to that question? How have you changed this decade?
One big category that came up was joy and play. I mean, when I look back a decade ago, I was accomplishing a lot for God and doing good things, but I was not a joyful person. I mean, just contrast. So this morning, I'm tired because of last night, getting in some time with God, but then Sherry kind of interrupts it and asks for my help. And now I'm in the kitchen on her turf doing spelling words with my kids. But I ended up making it a really playful game, and I'm cracking up the kids and my wife with these sentences on these spelling words. And Sherry just turned to me and she said, "You're funny, and I love being with you." And I actually was caught off guard because I didn't feel funny. I felt kind of irritated for doing it, but I wasn't trying to manufacture something. Yeah. I was actually being the person that I felt inside. And I realized I've become a more joyful person. I pursue joy. I seek joy, try to arrange for joy, try to bring joy to friends. And that is just a new category to value it, to value joy, to value play as essential elements to the Christian life. And its fruit is just so profound, particularly in my marriage. But I was not a playful person. I was not a joyful person. And now that's another big category.
So if I brought my fart machine to the Christmas Eve dinner, you would enter in a little more than you did 12 years ago?
Let's be honest. That was one of the highlights of your life as a prankster. That night. Okay, I got to tell the story. Christmas Eve, Craig shows up at my house with his grown daughters.
I was invited. What do you mean shows up?
Okay.
Tell the story right.
Well, whose story is it?
Well, we'll see.
Okay. So Craig shows up. His daughters are looking lovely. My wife is there, and Craig's wife is there, and we're circled around welcoming them to the magic of Christmas when...
Well, I took a few moments in the beginning to place a fart machine strategically in your area and waiting for the right moment. And the right moment was after the Christmas carols and the profound telling of the Christmas story and just the deep joy being together and celebrating this magical moment. I hit the remote on the fart machine, and Can I share your response?
Oh, you bet, because I'd never seen a fart machine, wasn't aware it was planted in my house.
This is the unplayful Morgan of many years ago. So I hit the fart machine, and it does what it does. And Morgan immediately throws Sherry under the bus, saying, that wasn't me. It was Sherry.
We're in this holy circle, and someone rips this big-ass fart, like, right next to me. And I look at my wife, and I know it wasn't me.
Everyone's looking at Morgan.
Everyone's looking at me, and I'm looking at her going, what'd you just do? I was blown away. There you go.
Yeah. So you're a different man now. You'd enter in.
Oh, my goodness. Well, now we have our own fart machine. We take it with us on every family trip. Oh. But a great example where, yeah, it's perfect, Greg. We're now on the bearer of the fart machine. But there is so much joy to be had. We fight battles, and it is epic, and there's a heroic role, and there are casualties left and right. And like you alluded to, Craig, with my brother and others this decade, no doubt there are casualties, but the joy of God is our strength. And in this decade, I'm actually beginning to believe it and live it and bask in the fruit of it.
Morgan, talk about when you look ahead, if this is the beginning for you of the next 10 years.
Yes.
Do you have a hint at some of the things God is stirring in you, some of the new frontier for the decade that's coming?
One way to approach that question, I think, this decade, more than any time in my life, has created the worldview at the core of my belief system that I've become a lifetime disciple. And so I am committed to becoming an apprentice of Jesus, as Dallas is learning to live as he would live if he were living my life. Yeah. So I would say I've been baptized into, I'm a lifetime student. I want to continue to be apprenticed in how to live in the kingdom of God. And in some ways, I feel like a freshman in college in that category, but I'm not in high school anymore. There's something of I've graduated from some basics, but it feels like mostly frontier. It doesn't feel like mostly I've arrived. It feels like mostly it's ahead of me. But the biggest transition for me, I've been very intentional over the last 16 years to be in this season of choosing to take the lower seat, choosing training, choosing character over building my own kingdom. And it really feels like God, for other conversations at another time, is really promoting me and moving me in a pretty distinct way into this next phase of kingship and leadership. And in some ways, I can validate that it's true because for the first time in my life, I don't want it and I'm not looking for it. And I feel the dread in a way. Yeah. I'd rather have happy little life because now my marriage is better than ever and my life with my children are better than ever. And I have a rhythm that's better than ever. And I'd like to keep it this way, but God's always upgrading the challenges. He gives us a promotion, and so that we are required to upgrade our experience of him. And so I would say I'm kind of on the front end of this intentional role of king as a metaphor for my masculine journey, but at the same time, I am fiercely committed to a lifetime of being an apprentice.
Those are good observations, Morgan. I'd like to add a couple that I've seen. Though you're some form of an introvert, I've really seen you courageously choose to move towards people and love well. I mean, I think you have grown enormously as a lover. You love others, you move towards others, you sacrifice time that you could be efficient and effective and productive to hear someone's story of their son's basketball championship game when you could be getting other things done. So I've really seen you move in the direction of loving others well and strongly, being present, engaged. Another category I'd say that I've seen in you is you have a gift as a teacher that is really showing itself, and God is shaping it, developing it. You're still young in it, but such an open and teachable heart. It's just going to be fun to see the teacher and the man that you are in 10 years that you're becoming now. It's actually pretty remarkable because 12 years ago, I remember us doing an online doctrinal test where you answer questions and the I think it was BeliefNet or something spits back what your answer to those questions expose you as being.
This is referring to when you were discipling me in that theology program.
This is when I realized you needed discipling. But I'll never forget, and I've milked it since then, that you answered those questions as a young follower of Christ, and you came out Jehovah's Witness and Mormon.
Hey, there were some trick questions in there.
Yeah, is Jesus God?
Is Joseph Smith part of the Trinity?
But seriously, Morgan, you've got a gift that is just starting to blossom, and that's a big change. You've gone from a sergeant to now a major, and as you alluded to as you spoke, that you are a king, and you have the gifts that a king needs to be a good king. And it's just, you're a different man. And in fact, listeners, if you want to know how different he is, you need to go to the Band of Brothers video and just look at us. That was, 12 years ago?
Oh, my goodness.
I look at you and I go, who's Sasquatch? Who is that sitting on the couch?
Oh, my goodness. Another lifetime.
Yeah. When we look at that now, how do you feel? It's like, oh, my.
Right. You realize there was a lot of water under the bridge.
Is that only 10 years ago?
Oh, my goodness. It's hopeful. It's hopeful to see how much God does in a season. And Craig, I really appreciate those words. Mm-hmm. I take them to heart. I need them. Mm-hmm. And they're like food. So thank you. And I think even in closing, to react to that is, while I do receive all that is true, I'm just aware in this conversation of how much I still want to grow and mature, all the not yet. When you posed the question of how have you changed, I found myself asking also the question of where do I feel sadness and disappointment over how I haven't? And it took me to this teaching under Dallas Willard, and he suggested that if you had to describe in one word what you felt around Jesus and his presence, what word would it be? And he used the word relaxed. And that word has really penetrated my soul, because in all the positive things we've talked about in this really precious time for me, in my story and my growth, I think when people experience me, they experience lots of good things a lot of the time. And yet the word relaxed, I think, would be rarely associated with me, at least not to the degree that I long to be. And so I receive all that you guys have shared with me this morning to encourage me. And then I just choose to land in the place of I want more. I want more. I want to be a more whole man a decade from now. And I look forward to getting back in the studio and having that conversation.
So good.
Well put. Well put. This has been the Ransom Heart Podcast. Just enjoyed being with you guys, Alan and Morgan. And we're signing off now, and hope that you continue to listen, and that these podcasts, as well as all the other resources of Ransomed Heart, just really encourage and stimulate your love for God, your passion for Him, your desire to grow, walk with Him. And to get a good overview of all that we have, go to ransomheart.com. Check it out. We've got things that will really help you, encourage you in your walk with Christ.